The House of Commons was packed to capacity on this Wednesday afternoon in November 2024. MPs filled every green bench, the galleries were overflowing with journalists, and the tension in the chamber was electric. Prime Minister's questions was about to begin, and everyone could sense that something big was brewing. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak sat on the government front bench, adjusting his tie nervously as he shuffled through his briefing notes. Across the aisle, Labour leader Keir Starmer sat calm and still, a thin folder of papers in front of him. The contrast was striking. Sunak looked like a man preparing for battle, while Starmer looked like a prosecutor who already knew he'd won the case. For months, Sunak had been struggling with scandals, economic disasters, and plummeting poll numbers. His government was in chaos, the Conservative Party was fracturing, and whispers of leadership challenges were growing louder every day. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. Before we dive into this absolutely explosive PMQs session that left the entire political world stunned, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Trust me, what you're about to see is the kind of political destruction that ends careers and reshapes British politics forever. At exactly 12:00 p.m., Speaker Lindsay Hoyle called the House to order. "Prime Minister's questions," he announced, his voice echoing through the historic chamber. Keir Starmer. What happened next wasn't just a political exchange. It was a systematic demolition. Starmer rose to his feet with the confidence of a man who had spent weeks preparing for this moment, armed with information that would not only destroy Sunak's credibility, but expose corruption at the very heart of the Conservative government. The question Starmer asked was simple. Sunak's response was a disaster. But what came after that left the Prime Minister speechless, the Conservative MPs silent, and the entire country watching as one of the most devastating political takedowns in all British parliamentary history unfolded live on television. This is the story of how Keir Starmer ended Rishi Sunak's political career in just 6 minutes of Prime Minister's questions. To understand why this PMQs session became legendary, and why it effectively ended Rishi Sunak's time as Prime Minister, you need to understand who these two men are and what brought them to this moment of political destruction. So Keir Starmer didn't come to politics through the usual route of university politics and party activism. Before becoming Labour leader, he was one of Britain's top lawyers, Director of Public Prosecutions, the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, and a Queen's Counsel known for his meticulous preparation and devastating cross-examinations. At 62, Starmer brought a prosecutor's mindset to politics. He didn't just attack, he built cases. He didn't just criticize, he presented evidence. His background defending human rights cases and prosecuting complex fraud cases had taught him how to take down powerful people who thought they were untouchable. When Starmer became Labour leader in 2020, many political commentators said he was too boring, too methodical, too much like a lawyer to succeed in the theatrical world of British politics. They were wrong. His legal training had given him exactly the skills needed to dismantle opponents who relied on bluster and misdirection. Starmer's strength wasn't in passionate speeches or emotional appeals, it was in preparation. He would spend days before PMQs with his team, going through every document, every statistic, every potential line of attack. By the time he stood up in the Commons, he knew more about the government's failures than the government did. But more importantly, Starmer had learned something crucial during his years as a prosecutor. Powerful people always think they're smarter than they are, and they always leave evidence of their wrongdoing. You just have to know where to look. Rishi Sunak, at 44, represented everything that was wrong with modern Conservative politics. Born into wealth, educated at Winchester and Oxford, married to a billionaire's daughter, he had never faced real hardship or real consequences for his mistakes. Sunak had become Prime Minister not through electoral victory, but through Conservative party leadership contests after Liz Truss's disastrous 49-day tenure crashed the economy. He was the third Conservative PM in just 2 years, leading a party that was falling apart and a government that had lost all credibility. But Sunak's biggest weakness wasn't his privileged background. It was his arrogance. He genuinely believed he was the smartest person in every room, that his Goldman Sachs background and tech industry connections made him superior to career politicians like Starmer. This arrogance had led him to make increasingly reckless decisions. He had ignored advice from civil servants, dismissed warnings from his own MPs, and most dangerously, he had started cutting corners and bending rules because he thought he was too clever to get caught. Sunak's approach to PMQs was typically arrogant. He would arrive with a few pre-written soundbites, confident that his quick wit and private school debating skills would be enough to handle whatever Starmer threw at him. He had never faced a prosecutor before. By November 2024, Sunak's government was drowning in scandals. The economy was still struggling from the trust disaster. The NHS was in crisis. Immigration numbers were at record highs despite Conservative promises to bring them down. The party was 20 points behind Labour in the polls. But the scandal that would destroy Sunak was still hidden from public view. For weeks, investigative journalists and Labour researchers had been digging into a complex web of government contracts, personal relationships, and financial benefits that led directly to the Prime Minister's office. The story involved millions of pounds in government contracts awarded to companies with direct links to Conservative donors. It involved personal favours for wealthy friends. It involved the use of government resources for party political purposes. And it involved Rishi Sunak personally signing off on decisions that directly benefited his own financial interests. Most damaging of all, there were WhatsApp messages, emails, and documents that proved Sunak knew exactly what he was doing and had deliberately tried to hide it from Parliament and the public. This wasn't just another PMQs session. The Conservative Party was already discussing leadership challenges. The media was full of speculation about early elections. The country was losing faith in the entire political system. For Sunak, this was his chance to show that he could still command the Commons and lead his party. A good performance could buy him time and silence his critics. A bad performance could end his career. For Starmer, this was the moment he had been preparing for since becoming Labour leader. He had the evidence to prove that the Conservative government was corrupt. He had the legal skills to present that evidence devastatingly. And he had the political opportunity to land the knockout punch that would make Labour's victory in the next election inevitable. But neither man knew that. This PMQ session would become one of the most watched and analysed political moments in British history. Neither knew that the exchange they were about to have would be studied in politics courses for decades to come, as an example of how to completely destroy a political opponent using nothing but facts, preparation, and surgical precision. What they both knew was that when Starmer stood up to ask his first question, one of their political careers would be over by the time he sat down. The House of Commons fell silent as Speaker Lindsay Hoyle called for Prime Minister's questions to begin. The packed chamber buzzed with anticipation. Everyone could sense that something significant was about to happen. Keir Starmer rose slowly from his seat, holding a single piece of paper. His voice was calm and measured as he began his first question. Mr. Speaker, on October 15th, the Prime Minister personally approved a $47 million contract for digital infrastructure to Apex Technologies Limited. Can the Prime Minister tell this House what due diligence was carried out before awarding this contract? It seemed like a routine question about government procurement. Sunak looked relieved. This was exactly the kind of technical question he thought he could handle easily. The Prime Minister stood up with his characteristic smirk, clearly thinking this would be an easy win. Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted the Right Honourable Gentleman is taking an interest in our government's efforts to modernise Britain's digital infrastructure. The contract he mentions went through all proper procedures, was assessed by the relevant departments, and represents excellent value for taxpayers' money. Perhaps he should spend less time looking backward and more time supporting our efforts to build a digital Britain for the future. Conservative MPs cheered and waved their order papers. Sunak looked pleased with himself, thinking he'd deflected the question and turned it into an attack on Labour's lack of vision. But anyone watching Starmer carefully would have noticed that he wasn't looking defeated. If anything, He looked like a prosecutor who had just gotten exactly the answer he wanted. Starmer stood again, this time with a slightly different tone in his voice. The Prime Minister talks about proper procedures. So can he explain why Apex Technologies Limited was incorporated just 6 weeks before receiving this $47 million contract? And can he explain why the company's registered address is the same as that of his personal financial advisor, Mr. James Morrison? A murmur went through the chamber. This wasn't a routine question anymore. Conservative MPs stopped cheering. Sunak's expression changed from confident to concerned. Sunak stood up again, but this time his voice was slightly defensive. Mr. Speaker, the right honorable gentleman is making wild accusations without evidence. Government contracts are awarded on merit, following all proper procedures. If he has specific allegations to make, he should take them to the appropriate authorities rather than using this chamber for political point scoring. It was exactly the wrong response. By accusing Starmer of making wild accusations, Sunak had challenged him to produce evidence, and Starmer had plenty of evidence. Starmer stood again, and this time he was holding a thick folder instead of a single paper. Wild accusations, Mr. Speaker? Let me help the Prime Minister with some facts. Apex Technologies Limited has no employees, no offices, and no track record of delivering digital infrastructure projects. Its sole director is Mr. James Morrison, who has been the Prime Minister's personal financial advisor since 2019 and who attended his birthday party just last month. Does the Prime Minister still think these are wild accusations? The chamber was completely silent now. Conservative MPs were looking uncomfortable. Even Sunak's closest allies on the front bench were shifting nervously in their seats. Sunak stood up quickly, his face now visibly red. Mr. Speaker, this is exactly the kind of gutter politics we've come to expect from the opposition. The right honorable gentleman is making personal attacks on my friends and advisors based on conspiracy theories and half-truths. I will not stand here and allow him to smear good people who are working hard to serve this country. The response was a disaster. Sunak had just admitted that Morrison was his friend, not just his advisor. He had also lost his cool, which made him look guilty and defensive. Starmer sensed blood in the water. His next question was delivered with the precision of a master prosecutor. Conspiracy theories, Mr. Speaker? Then perhaps the Prime Minister can explain these WhatsApp messages from his own phone, obtained through a Freedom of Information request. On September 30th, he messaged Mr. Morrison saying, quote, "The digital contract we discussed is going through Cabinet next week. Make sure your paperwork is ready." Does the Prime Minister deny sending this message? The chamber erupted. Conservative MPs were shouting, "Where's the evidence?" But their protests sounded desperate. Opposition MPs were on their feet calling for Sunak to resign. The Speaker was banging his gavel, trying to restore order. When order was finally restored, Sunak stood up, but he looked shaken. His voice was strained and defensive. "Mr. Speaker, I categorically deny any wrongdoing. My conversations with advisors are privileged and confidential. The opposition leader is taking private communications out of context to create a false narrative. This is a disgraceful abuse of the parliamentary process." But his denial was weak, and everyone in the chamber could sense it. He hadn't actually denied sending the message. He had just said his conversations were private. Starmer could sense that Sunak was wounded and desperate. He stood for what everyone sensed would be his final question, and his voice carried the authority of someone delivering a verdict. "Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister talks about false narratives. So let me be very clear about the true narrative. He personally approved a $47 million contract to a shell company owned by his friend. He discussed this contract in private messages before it went to Cabinet. And when that friend's company received the money, 2.3 million of it was immediately transferred to an investment fund that the Prime Minister's family trust holds shares in." The chamber was deadly silent. You could hear a pin drop. Conservative MPs looked stunned. Even Sunak's most loyal supporters were staring at him in shock. Starmer continued, his voice growing stronger. "So my final question is simple. Will the Prime Minister now admit that he has used his office to personally profit from public contracts? Or will he continue to insult the intelligence of this House and the British people? Every eye in the chamber was on Rishi Sunak. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom stood there, mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to find words. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. These are complex financial arrangements. I have always acted within the law. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't an explanation. It was the sound of a political career ending in real time. The chamber erupted in chaos. Opposition MPs were on their feet demanding his resignation. Conservative MPs were slumping in their seats, realizing their leader had just confessed to corruption on live television. The speaker was frantically calling for order. But through all the noise, one thing was clear. Keir Starmer had just delivered the most devastating parliamentary performance in modern British political history, and Rishi Sunak's time as Prime Minister was over. The silence in the House of Commons stretched on as Rishi Sunak stood frozen at the dispatch box, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The most powerful man in Britain had just been reduced to stammering incoherence by 6 minutes of methodical questioning from Keir Starmer. For nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in parliamentary time, Sunak said nothing. The cameras captured every moment of his deer-in-headlights expression as he desperately searched for words that wouldn't come. Conservative MPs behind him looked horrified. Some were shaking their heads, others were slumping forward with their heads in their hands. When Sunak finally found his voice, what came out was even worse than the silence. Mr. Speaker, these are complex financial arrangements that have been properly managed by professionals. I have always acted within the law and within the ministerial code. His voice was shaking. Sweat was visible on his forehead under the harsh parliamentary lights. The confident, arrogant Prime Minister who had stood up 6 minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he was about to be sick. Starmer remained standing, sensing that his opponent was completely broken. His voice was calm and measured, the voice of a prosecutor who had just secured a conviction. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he has acted within the law. But the law requires ministers to declare conflicts of interest. The law requires proper procurement procedures. The law requires transparency in government contracting. Which of these laws does he believe he has followed? It was a masterful follow-up question that gave Sunak no escape route. He couldn't claim to have followed the law without admitting he had broken it. He couldn't admit to breaking the law without admitting he should resign. Sunak's response was the sound of a political career dying. I resent the implication. My family's investments are managed independently. I don't. Personally, the ministerial code is very clear about. He couldn't finish a sentence. The man who had been Chancellor of the Exchequer, who had managed billions of pounds of public money, who had presented himself as a master of complex financial arrangements, couldn't string together a coherent response to save his career. Conservative MPs were looking at each other in horror. Several had their hands over their faces. On the front bench, Home Secretary James Cleverly was staring at his shoes, while Chancellor Jeremy Hunt was frantically writing notes, probably calculating how quickly he could distance himself from the Prime Minister. The opposition benches erupted in calls for Sunak's resignation. "Resign! Resign! Resign!" echoed through the chamber. Opposition MPs were on their feet, waving their order papers, sensing that they were witnessing the end of the Conservative government. Speaker Lindsay Hoyle was frantically banging his gavel, trying to restore order, but the chaos was spreading. Even some Conservative MPs were looking like they wanted to join the calls for resignation. Through it all, Starmer remained standing, calm and composed, watching the man who had called him boring and methodical completely fall apart under pressure. In the press gallery, Political journalists were typing frantically on their phones and laptops. The hashtag Chuck Sunak Resign was already trending on Twitter. News outlets were preparing breaking news alerts. Political commentators were calling it the most devastating PMQs performance they had ever witnessed. BBC political editor Chris Mason tweeted, "I've covered politics for 20 years. I've never seen a prime minister destroyed this completely, this quickly. Sunak is finished." Sky News' Beth Rigby wrote, "This isn't just a bad PMQs, this is a career-ending moment. Conservative MPs will be demanding Sunak's resignation within hours." On the Conservative benches, MPs were having whispered emergency conversations. Several were already leaving the chamber, presumably to call leadership contest organisers. Others were staring at Sunak with barely concealed fury, realising he had just destroyed their electoral chances. Former Chancellor Sajid Javid was seen shaking his head and checking his phone. Backbench MP Sir Graham Brady, chair of the 1922 committee, was taking notes that looked suspiciously like preparations for a leadership challenge. The body language on the government benches told the whole story. They knew their leader was finished, and they were already calculating their own survival. As order was slowly restored, Starmer delivered his final devastating blow. "Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has had multiple opportunities to explain these arrangements. He has had multiple opportunities to deny the allegations. He has had multiple opportunities to show leadership. Instead, we have seen evasion, confusion, and what appears to be an admission of wrongdoing. The British people deserve better than a Prime Minister who treats the public purse as his personal piggy bank." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Starmer had just accused the Prime Minister of corruption in the most formal parliamentary language possible, and Sunak had no response. Sunak made one last attempt to salvage something from the disaster. "Mr. Speaker, I reject entirely the characterization. My record speaks for itself. This government has delivered for the British people." But even his own MPs weren't listening anymore. Several Conservative backbenchers had left the chamber. Others were openly discussing leadership contests. The Prime Minister was talking, but nobody was paying attention. Speaker Hoyle, sensing that the session was spiraling completely out of control, made an unusual intervention. "Order, order. We will move on to the next question. I would remind all members that this is Prime Minister's questions, not Prime Minister's resignation." But everyone in the chamber knew that's exactly what they had just witnessed. The resignation of a Prime Minister, delivered not in a formal statement but in 6 minutes of devastating cross-examination that had exposed corruption at the very heart of government. As PMQs officially ended and MPs began filing out of the chamber, the political earthquake was already beginning. Conservative MPs were huddled in urgent conversations. Opposition leaders were giving impromptu interviews to waiting journalists. Political commentators were already calling it a historic moment. Sunak left the chamber quickly, head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He looked like a man who knew his career was over, but hadn't quite processed how completely he had been destroyed. Starmer, meanwhile, was surrounded by jubilant Labour MPs, but he remained calm and composed. He had done what he came to do. He had exposed the corruption, presented the evidence, and watched his opponent destroy himself under questioning. But the real drama was just beginning. Within hours, Conservative MPs would be submitting letters of no confidence. Within days, a leadership contest would be announced. Within weeks, Rishi Sunak would be gone, and the Conservative Party would be facing electoral oblivion. Keir Starmer had just delivered the most devastating political performance in modern British history, and everyone who witnessed it knew they had seen the moment that changed everything. What happened after Keir Starmer's demolition of Rishi Sunak wasn't just political drama. It was a political earthquake that re-shook British politics and demonstrated the power of methodical preparation over arrogant improvisation. Within minutes of PMQ's ending, Sunak destroyed and dunked Starmer masterclass were trending worldwide on social media. The 6-minute exchange had been viewed over 10 million times on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube before most MPs had even left Westminster. But this wasn't just about viral numbers. It was about the quality and impact of the content. Political. Commentators from across the spectrum were calling it the most effective parliamentary performance they had ever witnessed. Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery tweeted, "I've been a conservative all my life, but that was a masterclass in holding power to account. Sunak is finished, and he deserves to be." Even international observers were taking notice. CNN's Christiane Amanpour called it the most devastating political takedown since Watergate, while French political analyst Christine Ockrent wrote, "British parliamentary democracy at its finest, accountability through skilled questioning." The reaction within the Conservative Party was swift and brutal. By 6 p.m. that evening, Sir Graham Brady, chair of the 1922 committee, announced that he had received the 54 letters needed to trigger a confidence vote in Sunak's leadership. But it went beyond just the formal process. Conservative MPs were openly calling for Sunak's resignation on television news programs. Former cabinet ministers were distancing themselves from his government. Even his closest allies were struggling to defend the indefensible. Home Secretary James Cleverly, one of Sunak's most loyal supporters, could only manage. "The Prime Minister will need to address these serious allegations in detail," when pressed by journalists outside Parliament. Former Chancellor Sajid Javid was more direct. "If these allegations are true, they represent a fundamental breach of the ministerial code and public trust." Every major newspaper, regardless of political affiliation, led with the story the next morning. The Times headline read, "6 minutes that ended a premiership." The Guardian went with, "The prosecutor's perfect case." Even the traditionally conservative Telegraph couldn't defend Sunak, running with PM's fatal PMQs fumble. Political editors who had covered British politics for decades were struggling to find historical comparisons. BBC's Laura Quinsberg wrote, "In 30 years of political journalism, I've never seen a prime minister so completely exposed and destroyed in such a short space of time." The Financial Times, focusing on the economic implications, noted, "Markets are already pricing in a change of government following Sunak's PMQs disaster." Sterling strengthened against the dollar as investors anticipated political stability under a future Labour government. In the days following the PMQs session, details emerged about the months of preparation that had gone into Starmer's devastating performance. Labour sources revealed that his team had been investigating the Apex Technologies contract for over 3 months, working with investigative journalists and using freedom of information requests to piece together the evidence. The WhatsApp messages that proved so damaging had been obtained through a complex legal process involving data protection laws and parliamentary privilege. Starmer's legal background had been crucial in understanding how to obtain and use this evidence effectively. Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves told the BBC, "This is what happens when you combine prosecutorial skills with political strategy." Keir didn't just attack. He built a case, presented evidence, and let the facts speak for themselves. The PMQs session had implications far beyond British domestic politics. International investors, who had already been concerned about British political stability following the chaos of recent years, saw Starmer's performance as evidence that Labour offered a credible alternative government. The European Union, which had been struggling to work with the unstable Conservative government, quietly began reaching out to Labour figures to discuss potential future relationships. US President Joe Biden's administration, which had found Sunak difficult to work with, was reportedly relieved at the prospect of dealing with Starmer, whose legal background and measured approach were seen as more compatible with American diplomatic style. The session also had profound implications for how Prime Minister's questions functioned as a democratic institution. Political scientists began analyzing Starmer's approach as a model for effective parliamentary scrutiny. Professor Jane Green from Oxford University wrote, "This PMQ session showed how Parliament can still hold the executive to account when MPs Come prepared with facts rather than sound bites. It's a lesson for democracies worldwide. The session was immediately incorporated into politics courses at universities across Britain as an example of how parliamentary democracy should work. Thorough preparation, evidence-based questioning, and holding power accountable through skilled cross-examination. In the days following the PMQs disaster, Sunak attempted various forms of damage control, but each effort only made things worse. His office released a statement claiming the WhatsApp messages had been taken out of context, but couldn't explain what context would make them acceptable. He attempted a TV interview with the BBC's Laura Quinsberg, but his performance was so poor that even Conservative MPs were calling it career-ending. When asked directly whether he had personally profited from government contracts, he again failed to give a clear denial. Conservative MPs were openly briefing against him. One senior backbencher told The Times, "He's not just corrupt, he's incompetent." The way he handled those questions showed he's not fit to be Prime Minister. Within a week of the PMQs session, Sunak announced his resignation as Conservative Party leader, though he remained as caretaker Prime Minister. The leadership contest that followed was dominated by candidates trying to distance themselves from his government and his corruption. Former Foreign Secretary Liz Truss attempted a comeback, arguing that her brief tenure had been unfairly cut short. Defense Secretary Ben Wallace positioned himself as the clean hands candidate. Home Secretary Priti Patel tried to appeal to the party's right wing, but the contest was overshadowed by the damage Sunak had done to the Conservative brand. Polling showed Labour with a 25-point lead, and even Conservative supporters were calling for an immediate general election. The PMQ's performance transformed Starmer from a competent opposition leader into a Prime Minister in waiting. His approval rating soared across all demographic groups, including traditional Conservative voters who were impressed by his methodical approach and integrity. Labour's fundraising increased dramatically as donors who had been hesitant about Starmer's electoral prospects suddenly saw him as a certainty for number 10. Membership applications flooded in from people inspired by his performance. But perhaps most importantly, the session established Starmer's credentials as someone who could stand up to corruption and hold power accountable. After years of political chaos and scandal, voters were desperate for competent, honest leadership. The corruption scandal exposed by Starmer's questioning led to immediate calls for reform of government procurement processes and ministerial oversight. Labour announced plans for a new Office of Government Ethics and stricter rules on conflicts of interest. The session also highlighted the importance of freedom of information laws and parliamentary privilege in holding government accountable. Transparency campaigners used the moment to push for stronger disclosure requirements and better protection for whistleblowers. Beyond politics, the PMQs session became a cultural moment that transcended traditional political boundaries. The clip was shared millions of times on social media, often with comments from people who normally ignored politics but were impressed by Starmer's systematic demolition of corruption. Young people in particular were inspired by seeing someone use facts and preparation to hold power accountable. Political engagement among 18 to 24-year-olds increased significantly in the weeks following the session. Political historians were already calling the session one of the most significant moments in modern British political history. Professor Peter Hennessy from King's College London wrote, "This will be remembered as the moment when parliamentary democracy reasserted itself after years of executive overreach and corruption." The session was compared to great moments of parliamentary scrutiny throughout British history, from Burke's impeachment of Warren Hastings to the expenses scandal of 2009. But many argued it surpassed them all in its combination of legal precision, political timing, and devastating effectiveness. 6 months after the PMQs session, Keir Starmer was Prime Minister with a Labour majority of over 100 seats. The Conservative Party, still reeling from the Sunak scandal, had suffered their worst electoral defeat since 1906. Sunak himself had left politics entirely, facing ongoing investigations by the Serious Fraud Office and parliamentary standards committees. The man who had once been Chancellor and Prime Minister was now a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Conservative governance. But perhaps most importantly, the session had restored faith in British democratic institutions. It had shown that even the most powerful people could be held accountable, that preparation and integrity could triumph over arrogance and corruption, and that Parliament could still fulfill its historic role of scrutinizing the executive. Starmer-Sunak PMQs session would be remembered not just as a moment of great political theatre, but as a turning point in British democracy. It showed that in an age of spin and soundbites, substance still mattered. In an era of post-truth politics, facts still had power. And in a time when many had lost faith in the political system, one man's methodical preparation and moral clarity had reminded everyone why parliamentary democracy was worth defending. Thanks for watching this incredible moment where preparation met corruption and justice won the day. If you believe in holding politicians accountable and celebrating leaders who use facts and evidence to expose wrongdoing, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll continue bringing you the most important political moments as they happen, because in times like these, every citizen needs to stay informed about the people who represent us and the standards we demand from them. What did you think of Starmer's systematic takedown? Have you ever seen a politician so completely destroyed by their own words and actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in this democracy, and moments like these remind us why we must never stop demanding honesty, integrity, and accountability from those in power.